Good morning. This is Dr. Mike, and we get week 2 underway. This is the first lecture of the week by talking about the nature of reality. And this is one of the things that in the course that you probably maybe haven't thought about in the past. This course will bring to light many things that we probably don't spend our time thinking about, but someone has. And of course, there's no end to learning and new things. And so as we start to talk about reality and understanding what is what we perceive to be the reality around us, it's really important that we understand that people have placed some scaffolding, if you will, around that idea to help us to understand maybe how we perceive different things. It's amazing in history, the people that have thought and written about that. Albert Einstein, who you no doubt know the name, did a great deal of thought about that, and whether there were alternative universes, or whether, you know, that what was in the, if we were just one of many different universes in which people inhabited it, and what constituted the real world that we live in. And of course, I guess we all have different concepts of reality and things that we live with, but we believe in faith that things are going to improve. I mean, that's been a constant challenge through the years to look at and think about the future. And of course, when I teach American history, there have been many times where, you know, the people's faith in their future, in their government, in their peoples, were at an all-time low, and they managed to come back and to rise up. I think that the springs of hope, someone has said, spring eternal, they constantly tend to come back, and we tend to be able to, you know, gather ourselves no matter what the catastrophe, and go on. Many of you, maybe you're too young to even remember 9/11, but when that happened in New York and the World Trade Centers collapsed, that was probably one of the low points in modern history, when we realized that this destruction, or this evil that's in the world, is going to overcome the civilized traits and tendencies that we so often count on and look at, that we are somehow making progress, that we're moving forward. And so it's important for us to kind of give some thought, and as we go through this, to the idea that we're a hopeful people. As human beings, we're constantly looking for things that will encourage us and to cause us to move forward. So the question then is, what is the most real? What do we understand? Our senses, if you wanted to put it in purely a mechanical form, but your senses take in on a daily basis all kinds of readings about the world that's around you. We see that in some of the TV programs with robots and things, that they're sensing the world, that they are looking, but we are looking and listening and feeling and sensing and discussing and talking. All of these things we take for granted because we're able to do them. But if you were to lose one of your senses, you right away would realize how limiting that would be. I had a pastor friend once, his wife had stomach surgery, and they inadvertently clipped the nerve that connected her taste and smell to her stomach. And you realize there is a connection. If you've ever gone into a restaurant where you can smell the food, several sensations overcome you. You salivate, you think about, you envision how the food's going to taste. I mean, you can listen, you go into certain restaurants, you listen to the sizzle as they bring a plate to the table. Those things are all designed to be inner working, and that creates a reality around you, that you're able to perceive things, and they register, as we have said, talking about the forms that Plato and Socrates and Aristotle talked about. There is an image in your brain somewhere of an apple, say, and you are immediately able to distinguish an apple from a pear, from an orange, from a fruit. But then it's much more complicated than that. You also sense that this is a Granny Smith apple. This is a red delicious. This is a yellow delicious. Somewhere in our brain, we have these tremendous files that when you see something, immediately it compares the files, and you immediately know what it means, what that object is. People that are born blind will have a very limited view of that. They've never seen anything. So how would you ever conceptualize an apple from a car? And so your other senses do take over, and they do try to make up for that. But the reality that you live in is pretty much created by your mind. And so that's kind of a weighty concept, is it not? That and the question is anything really real, or is it a product of our mind and our thinking? Some people would say that nothing is real, and they would give a low ranking to virtually every entity that we could talk about. And then we talk about real compared to what? My reality compared to your reality is could be something different. And you've heard people say, well, that person just doesn't live in the real world. And that's what they're talking about. Their perception of reality is very different from mine. I was raised in a home where you worked for what you got. And I started my first job when I was 14, and I've worked ever since, and I'll be 65 this year. I've always had at least one job, many times 2 or 3 at a time, and I have never been without employment. I was raised with a very high level of belief that in a work ethic that the Bible says, if you don't eat, you don't work, you don't eat. That was the world that I lived in. That was my reality. But there are many people today that apparently don't have that reality. They don't work, they don't want to work, and then they want to depend on others for everything that they get. But that reality is not, it's not very forthcoming. You might exist with that, but you're not going to excel or move ahead. So the important question that we want to talk about in this chapter is what is real, and the concept of that. And on the other hand, why is it here? What is the purpose? We're trying to come to the terms with what is the purpose for our being on the planet. And that's what philosophy really thinks about, is understanding what is real, why are we here, what is our purpose, maybe where are we going, if you're religious and want to think about that. So human beings have always had these questions from the time that they were conscious, that they would think about that. And so philosophy is basically an attempt to try to answer some of those existential questions. And it's amazing because you will have an existential breakdown sometime probably in your life where you may have already had that, but where you try to answer these questions. And so sometimes religion will help you answer those questions. If you believe there is a God, if you believe there is a heaven or hell even, those are going to be realities that you live by that will shape your life and your understanding. And or if you don't believe in religion, you also have to construct a reality that you're going to live in with your own belief system. And we all do that. And some of us struggle with that. And some of us take a long time to do that. So people never get to where they have a reality that they're comfortable with, or that they happen with. We talk about the term metaphysics, and metaphysics is an attempt to say what reality is. It's an attempt to define that. Cosmology, another term that you will see in this chapter, deals with how we think the most real things have come into being. And that's one of the components of metaphysics. Another is ontology, the study of what is. And in developing an ontology as a part of our attempts to formulate our metaphysics, we have to evaluate different entities in the world, and we have to pick out the ones that are the most basic. And so when you're creating or thinking about creating a reality, you start with the very basic objects. There's no point in starting way up, 5 levels above where we actually live. So, and we've already anticipated 2 of the tests that we impose on this notion of what is most real. First of all, the most real is that upon which everything else depends. So think about that for a moment. For a religious person, God is the most real because everything else depends upon God. If we are a religious person, we find our foundation in Him. We talk about God being the rock of our salvation. It is the foundational element upon which everything else depends. When we talk about a worldview, we talk about a Christian worldview many times. I've taught in many Christian schools and still do through the years. And they always talk about developing a Christian worldview in which everything that you do and that you are and that you believe is founded upon the foundation of your religion. And upon that religion, you build your hope and your help, and you build your friends and your life, and you're faithful to that religion. You operate within that. Well, they have a distinctive worldview. They have a distinctive metaphysics, and the the ontology is there to talk about what is real and what is not. A scientist would be exactly the opposite. For a scientist, the principles and the particles that are the most real are the things of atoms that are make up the world. We talk about the basic building blocks. If the scientist is interested in cancer, they're looking at cancer at a very small atomic level. I noticed this week that there's a new study out about lung cancer, and the thing they think they understand now what happens that causes lung cancer to be so devastating to the human body. So they're studying at a very microscopic level, and that's where reality is. When you go into a doctor, he's looking at you from the external point of view, and he's got to determine what the building blocks are of your problem. We often talk about that in terms of doctoring our symptoms and not get down to the root causes. A doctor that does that won't do you much good, but a doctor that sends you for tests, sends you to other experts, he's actually looking for the metaphysics of what it is that makes you sick or that you're having a trouble with. You realize that, these things are really, heavy lifting for most of us. We probably haven't thought about that much in our lives. And so, it's important, though, that we do look at that with what is the most real. What is the most real can't be created and can't be destroyed. It doesn't change. And so when we talk about religion, God created the earth and the heavens, the Bible tells us, and we can't destroy that. But God was not only the creator, but God also can't be destroyed. He is the very basic element of human nature. Same thing true with scientists. They look at atoms. Atoms is the smallest indivisible unit of our nature. I mean, you can take a chair that is composed of atoms, you can destroy that chair, you can throw it into the fire, but the atoms, and reduce it down to its atomic levels or the smallest levels that we can, and the atoms of that chair are still there. Well, that's very interesting in relation to religion. My own personal religion believes that when a body dies, a person dies, that they are put into the ground and their body goes back to the dust. You remember that term. It goes back to the atoms from which it was made, and those atoms are the basic unit. But the religion also teaches that there will be a resurrection. Just like Eastern religions teach, there will be a revival. You'll come back as a different life form. And so, but the Christian religion teaches that those atoms will be gathered one day into a new body and come back, and your soul will go back into that body. Those are very basic teachings that teach us about, and so our reality is based upon that. To give you an example, when I buried both my mother and my father, I did the services. I was the family pastor, and we go out to the cemetery and we plant the body, and we say words like, we rest in hope of a resurrection. We're looking forward to another day when all these atoms come back together in a new body that won't be sick anymore, and those kind of things. So you know that language very well. You've heard it before, probably at the funeral of your own family members. But that's the very basic core of what people believe. And not everybody in that crowd believed that, of course. Not everybody in this class is going to believe that. You don't have to. This is not about indoctrinating you to a religion. I'm just telling you, this is how these things operate, and we don't think of them many times at that level. But if you are a scientist, you probably will believe something different. Now, there are many scientists that are devoted Christians, and I have been trained both in science and in theology, so I kind of walk a fine line between those two in things in science. But I also believe in atoms and indivisibility of atoms and those things. Getting those two things to work together can be quite a chore, and it takes a lot of work. And in fact, I'm working on a book on the subject of the war between science and religion, which we see today and every day in this battle of COVID and vaccines. You see where those two intersect in a very negative way. You have two people there with two different realities that are one's arguing that they don't want the vaccine, they don't want to wear a mask. And the other reality is, if you're going to be safe, you need a vaccine and a mask. So you see the two are kind of narrowed down to their basic components. One will reject science and doesn't believe in science and thinks science is trying to pull something on us, and the other one is a very strong adherent that this is the right way. This idea of metaphysics and metaphysicians go way back to the ancient Greeks, and you will have several of those that will you'll talk about in your textbook, and I encourage you to read that. There actually were thoughts about this long before Socrates, and in early Greece, before there was very much else. They were really thinking about these things. What kind of reality is it that I live in? How do I know that I'm here? How do I know that any of this is happening, that it's not just a movie or a dream? But you'll meet many of these philosophers in this study that I think you will find to be very much, very much interesting to read about. They're divided into two groups. There are early physical, the ones that believe in physical reality, and you'll talk about people like Thales and Heraclitus and Democritus in pages 112, 113. Be sure that you pick up on those. And then there are those that are maybe a non-physical view of reality of these different things. And one of the more famous ones that I did want to mention to you was Pythagoras of Samos. You might remember Pythagoras from a math theorem that you may have learned in high school called the Pythagorean theorem, which you learned in geometry if you got to take geometry. But Pythagoras was much more than just a mathematician. He was a philosopher, and he really worked on and thought about the things that happened. And he had a very interesting religious cult who's were at odds with most of the philosophy in the pre-Socratic period. But he established this brotherhood of religious believers in which numbers and mathematics were the basis of all things and had a special place in the universe. And we kind of subscribe to that in many ways. Today, numbers are important. There are people that enjoy numbers. They like to be, they're an accountant or they're a math teacher, because there is that absolute quality about numbers. You can't add 1 + 1 and get 3 ever, or 4 or 5, not even with the new math that we hear so much about. So it's important that we understand Pythagoras was one of those that believed in the absolute of numbers. Plato introduced us to the idea of forms. That is, those forms, you draw a triangle on a piece of paper and attempt to prove a theorem of Euclidean geometry about triangles. That triangle doesn't change, and those numbers don't change. And so when you come up with this formula, x squared plus y squared equals z squared, and of course you can figure out the size of a triangle just from knowing the two other sides, whether it's a right triangle or not. These kind of facts became, in most people's minds, proof that there was an absolute in the world, that those numbers don't change. As we move through science and other things, you'll find people like Isaac Newton who proved the law of gravity, that there were certain laws in the universe that were not changeable. That when you drop an apple, every time you drop an apple, that apple falls to the ground because of the theory of gravity. Gravity says that happens. Gravity is what holds us on this planet. If you're getting older and gaining weight, gravity is what makes us gain weight and feel bigger and all those things. But Aristotle went on to have a particular type of metaphysics that he talked about in all of this that was really important that you're going to read about. But there is a reality, and then there are appearances, and they stay intact. And so it's always true that we understand essential nature, that we understand the building blocks, because the further you get away from the building blocks, the more questions you have about what's real and what's not. Just like, go back to the medical example of a doctor when they come in to look at you. They take your external vitals, your blood pressure, your blood work. Sometimes they listen to your heart, and a doctor that's worth his salt always does those things. And then he may get down to the very basics, and he does blood work, and blood work analyzes your lipids and your cholesterol, all your vitamins, what you're missing, if you are iron deficient, or if you're B12 deficient, or if you're D deficient. And while the externals are important, the real gist of what you're doing is those minute looks at your blood work and other things. And so that's the difference. This is what Aristotle and these others are talking about, is that you need to get down to the very basics to understand a problem. And if you're going to get to the root cause of what your symptoms are, you don't put a Band-Aid on cancer. You do blood work, and you deal with the cancer at a microscopic level that we call chemotherapy or radiation or any of those things. That's where the real thing is happening. So externally, it may or may not be happening. Our mind is a wonderful thing. It operates within metaphysics quite wonderfully. We have familiarity with so many things, and there are people that would question that. Mind or consciousness is real. We talk about in psychology the three levels of consciousness: preconscious, unconscious, and conscious. The things that you know in your mind, that you see, that you hear, that you taste, that you feel, those are conscious acts usually. But they're also unconscious acts. We discovered in the 1950s that you could run so many frames of a picture in a movie, but it takes like 10 frames for your brain to register, hey, I saw a container of popcorn in that movie. It takes 10 frames for you to see that. What they found out was that they could run 5 frames of popcorn or Mars candy bar or a Coca-Cola, and their sales would jump up. People would get up and go out and buy popcorn or candy or Coke. And so during the age of advertising, they developed this idea and understanding that they could get people to buy things. They still do some of those. Some of those are illegal, but they still understand that what you see and how you react to it in your mind will result. How many of you have been sitting in front of your TV at night watching TV, and suddenly there comes this Taco Bell commercial on? I'm not going to ask you how many of you have actually got up and gone out and bought a taco, but sales are driven by that. Or if you're a man and you have a truck, nice truck sitting in your yard, they show you truck commercials at 9 o'clock at night. Doesn't matter how wonderful your truck is, but you feel like you're missing something because you don't have the latest and the greatest. Ladies' shoes, another issue with women. Ladies, I'm not going to ask you how many pairs of shoes you have because it might start a war at home. But I had a student actually who had 1,000 pairs of shoes, and her husband told her that if she would give up 250 pairs of shoes, that he would build her a shoe store or shoe storage in her bedroom. And so she agrees to that. He goes in and builds all these nice little cubbies for the boxes of shoes that she has. And so she got rid of 250 pairs of shoes, but she said, but I have 20 pairs in the trunk of my car that he doesn't know I have. So basically her addiction was driving what she, what she actually was doing. So, but our mind is an interesting concept. We create realities in our mind sometimes. You can convince yourself of something. If you dwell on it, think long enough about it, you can realize that things are, the real and the unreal. And if people that have mental illness sometimes that line between what's real and what's not will be great. You're going to be introduced in this chapter to some of the great names of philosophy, from Descartes to Spinoza to Leibniz. I want you to look very carefully at what they believed about the nature of the mind and the body and God and all these things, how they work, and there are lots of different things here that we could spend an entire course on, that we don't have the time to do that, but we will see lots of I think there are lots of things here that you can benefit from. The idea of idealism is a huge deal in philosophy. It says that what is real is mind, and all else, material objects, numbers, and ideas, are in the mind, and in some essence, sensed or dependent upon the mind for their existence. There are some things that if without the mind, you no longer have access to. And we see that sometimes when people get Alzheimer's or whatever, the materials are still there. You have a problem accessing and thinking about these, and they're really quite interesting. So as you read through this text, there's just a great deal of information that I would like to have the time to share with you, but I think you need to be exposed to these terms and these people so that you have a good grasp of what philosophy is all about. As you work on your things this week, be sure that you take some time to think about what you're reading and what you're writing about. And then tomorrow, we're going to talk about the search for truth. Truth is very much a philosophical concept. The question of is there one truth, or are there many truths? And is it situational? Are there times when truth is not as important as others? And so we'll talk about a lot of those things tomorrow. But thank you for your attention today and for this time that we've had together. As you work this week, please know that I am available. Please contact me if you need anything. And we'll talk to you tomorrow. Thank you.